Hi, I'm Jeffrey Wasserstrom, and I'm here to talk about a book I have coming out in February of 2020 called Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink, which puts the current crisis in Hong Kong into historical and comparative perspective. I'm delighted to be back working again with NCTA, recording this at TEA in Boulder. So the background to this book is that I've long been interested in student protests in China. And my initial work was on protests that took place between the 1910s and the 1940s in the city of Shanghai. And then for a lot of my early career, after finishing my dissertation in 1989, I focused on the events of 1989, the most famous student-led protests in late 20th century China. So I started going to Hong Kong in 1987, and when I went to Hong Kong the first times in the late 1980s and in the 1990s even, I thought of going there as a break from the research I was doing on these student-led mass movements. But then in recent years, I've become increasingly interested in Hong Kong events because Hong Kong has become the center of the most important events that have things in common with the events that I studied earlier in my career, such as the May 4th movement of 1919, the most important student-led mass movement on the mainland before 1949, and also they have things in common with the events of 1989. There were protests in Hong Kong at different points in the past, but the lead up to the events that have something in common with what's going on there right now in 2019 can be dated back to 2003. That was when there was a large-scale protest against bringing in a new security measure that was understood within Hong Kong as being something that would make political life in Hong Kong, which is considerably freer than in the cities just across the border on the mainland, more like political life in the mainland. And protesters pushed back against that, and the security measures, which were a lot like the Patriot Act that had been recently initiated in the United States, was tabled, put on hold. And so those protests were successful in a sense. In 2012, there was another wave of protests in a similar way. This time it was about bringing mainland-style patriotic education into Hong Kong, and protesters pushed back against that, and once again it was tabled. Then in 2014, what became known as the Umbrella Movement took place. And this was a push for bringing more democracy to Hong Kong, to allow Hong Kong people a direct say in how the chief executive was selected. There is an election for the chief executive, who is the most important, most powerful figure in the Hong Kong government, but less than 2,000 Hong Kong people get to vote for that election. And the only candidates who can stand for election are ones that Beijing considers acceptable, who are likely to do things that will line up with Beijing's agenda. So that protest took place, and it was an exciting protest. And for 79 days, the streets of Hong Kong were transformed, parts of it, including the Central District, into an occupied zone. When the protests began in 2014, they were called the Occupy Movement, Occupy Central with peace and love, or with love and peace. And then over time, it became known as the Umbrella Movement. The idea of an Occupy movement, this was a time when there were Occupy movements in other places. Most well known to Americans would be Occupy Wall Street. But it became known as the Umbrella Movement when something happened that was very important. When police trying to break up the protest turned pepper spray and then tear gas on the protesters. And Hong Kong's a very rainy climate, so one thing you often have in your possession is an umbrella. And the umbrella became, at that moment, a defense mechanism. Protesters started to use it to defend themselves against pepper spray and tear gas. And that then became the symbol of the movement. So in 2014, while this movement was taking place, and it built on the 2012 movement that had largely been a movement by high school students. In 2012, high school students and college students were very involved in the protests. And then members of other social groups began to gather on the streets in support of them. And over time, it became a movement that was in part about democracy in the terms of elections, but also was a movement, as many social movements become, a movement to defend the right to protest itself. And all the things that I just said about students being involved, about members of other social classes joining them on the streets, about it being a movement that began with one issue and then became about the right to protest itself, and a movement against police actions. All of that was true of a lot of the social movements that I'd studied in the past. It was true of the May 4th movement of 1919, and it was true of the 1989 protests of Tiananmen. And realizing that what was going on was the closest thing to a May 4th style, Tiananmen style protest to happen in any part of the People's Republic of China since 1989, I headed to Hong Kong, and I took photographs like this one that show a central part of a district being transformed into a kind of alternative world, quite a utopian world of community and solidarity. And it was a movement in which what Hong Kong people were struggling for, as they're struggling for as I speak now in October of 2019, was the ability to keep their city freer in terms of political life, civic life, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, to keep it freer than places on the mainland are. And the background for this, and I'll go into this in more detail, is the fact that in 1997, when British control over Hong Kong ended and Hong Kong was integrated into the People's Republic of China as a special administrative region, the same designation that came for nearby Macau in 1999, when it too went from being a colony to being a special part of the PRC, a deal was struck that for 50 years after 1997, something called One Country, Two Systems would apply. And what that meant was that Hong Kong would be part of the People's Republic of China in some ways, but in other ways would have a high degree of autonomy. And it would be able to maintain the different kind of rule of law that existed there, the ability to protest and assemble that existed there that did not really exist on the mainland. And it would, in general, maintain a separate identity while also being part of a larger entity. And the protests from 2003, 2012, 2014, and now 2019 are all pushing back against what's seen as an erosion of that special status. And there are two broad ways, one broad argument with two parts that I make in the book that I think are relevant for thinking about this, which is that when Hong Kong became part of the People's Republic of China in 1997, during the lead up to that, some people thought that right after the handover, political life, the differences in political life and freedom of speech and freedom of the press would just disappear. But to a large degree, that sort of special way of doing things was allowed to continue in Hong Kong. And there are a variety of reasons for this. But in any case, I think one thing I argue is that looked at from the future looking back, what some people might credibly think is that one surprising thing about Hong Kong since 1997 was how light a touch Beijing put onto the city, how willing they were to allow things to be done and said and published in Hong Kong that could not be published in any other part of the People's Republic of China. Macau also kept a certain degree of autonomy, and it's still there are things you can say and print and do in Macau that you can't do on mainland cities. But Macau has been more compliant overall, with some people pushing back, but overall less of this kind of resistance, and it's lacked these kinds of large-scale mass movements as Hong Kong. It's a kind of in-between space. But anyway, I think that looking from a kind of long-term historical perspective, it would be easy for people to conclude that a first surprise was how light a touch Beijing put on Hong Kong. And then the second surprise would be how quickly the screws began to tighten in the last decade, from about 2009 to 2019, and how they've tightened even more in the last 5 years when Xi Jinping, who's been tightening controls all over the People's Republic of China and has instituted more draconian forms of law, forms of rule in the most tightly controlled parts of the PRC, Tibet and Xinjiang in particular, where there's at the moment a terrible human rights crisis going on, with a large network of indoctrination camps being built across Xinjiang. In what were the most tightly controlled parts of the PRC, controls have been tightened still further. Across most of the mainland, where there had been a liberalizing trend for the last 10 years, there's been a trend away from that kind of liberalizing, and that trend away from liberalizing has increased under Xi Jinping, though it began before him. But then in Hong Kong, the most lightly controlled part of the PRC, there's also been a dramatic tightening of controls. So I think there are those two kinds of surprises, and that we should put the social movements and protests into context from that. There are two metaphors that are used that can be useful in thinking about these two surprising periods. The metaphor, they're both animal images. The animal image for the first part is of the golden goose, the goose that lays a golden egg and needs to be treated well in order to keep laying those golden eggs. Hong Kong was an economic prize for the People's Republic of China, which was still a relatively poor country in 1997. When the Communist Party got control of Hong Kong, one thing that a lot of people said is it will need to have a light form of control, because it can't do things that will scare away international business, that will destroy the things that make Hong Kong such a center of profit and such an important in-between space for money moving into and out of the People's Republic of China. There were always some people who were skeptical about that golden goose idea. Chris Patten, who was the last British colonial governor of Hong Kong, famously said that the golden goose idea was all well and good, but if you look closely, you'll find that history is littered with the corpses of decapitated geese. So there was always the idea that the golden goose at some point might be killed. And one reason for that might be if the People's Republic of China got strong enough economically that it didn't need Hong Kong economically as much, and that if the PRC got strong enough in its place in the world that it didn't need to be as worried about international opinion as it would have been in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And perhaps international businesses might so want to stay involved with the PRC that they would be willing to stay on even in a more tightly controlled Hong Kong. And I think we're seeing signs that the PRC has become just that kind of strong state economically and politically, and in a sense has less worry about the golden goose and keeping the golden goose happy. But the second animal imagery that comes from, that I started thinking about at least, from writings by a woman named Canny Leung, a Hong Kong writer, whose work was translated on the China Heritage website, a wonderful website that's run a lot of important work on Hong Kong, that's run by Jeremy Barmé, a leading sinologist and somebody with a deep affection for and familiarity with Hong Kong. But Canny Leung said that one way to think about Hong Kong is to remember the idea of the frog in a pot that's being brought to a boil. If the temperature in the pot goes up very slowly, the frog may get a sense that nothing really has changed and eventually will die. But if the frog notices the temperature rising, the frog will do anything in its power to escape. And I think the protests of particularly the last 7 years can be seen as reactions to the temperature being ratcheted up in the pot, and responding by trying to save the life of the city, or to save the life of parts of the city that are treasured by people. So I think those two images are also worth keeping in mind. I also play in the book with a geographical analogy that may seem counterintuitive at first, but I think has a lot going for it, which is to think of Hong Kong during the Cold War as being a kind of Asian doppelganger to West Berlin at the other end of Eurasia. These were two places where capitalism flourished, consumerism flourished, and there was a high degree of freedom of speech in the press that were right next to and perched at the edge of large Communist Party-run countries. And just over the border from them you couldn't do many things, and you couldn't buy many things that you could buy in Hong Kong and Berlin. And they became sort of listening posts for people trying to understand the communist world. Well, the issue is, since 1989, the two Berlins have been merged together, and now if you go to Berlin, as I did in May of 2019 while researching this book, you can move from the former West to the former East without being aware of exactly which side you're on, because it's largely one unified city again. And the way to think of the city is that the ways of West Berlin permeated East Berlin. The question is, what happened to Hong Kong in a parallel way after 1997, when it became more tightly linked to places across the border from it? And there was hope initially that something like that West Berlin phenomenon would happen, that the freer press, the freer forms of civil society would flow over to South China. And there were some signs of that happening. The media became freer in South China, just over the border from Hong Kong, than it was in the north. And certainly modes of consumption and entertainment that used to be common in Hong Kong but not in Shanghai became common in both those places. But overall, the story has been of moves in the opposite direction, of a move to integrate South China as a region. And there's talk of a greater Bay Area that would be a seamless integration of Hong Kong and Macau with places like Shenzhen across the border. But in that integration, it's been more a case of the East Berlin ways of doing things seeping into the West Berlin equivalent rather than vice versa. And I want to use a concrete illustration of this via one of the most important symbols of the 2014 protests that then again became important during the 2019 ones. And these were Lenin Walls, named after John Lennon, not Vladimir Lenin. And the Lenin Wall name comes from a wall in Prague. In the early 1980s, there was a wall in Prague that became decorated with graffiti and other kind of painting and art that honored John Lennon, who was an inspiring figure to people dreaming of a better world than the Cold War world, through his song Imagine in particular. And so he was admired by particularly youth in many parts of the world, including Prague. So when the protests started in Hong Kong in 2014, young people put up something called a Lenin Wall that was a colorful thing, which included some quotes from the song Imagine, but also many things with more local meanings. And it had a more local form to it because, as shown in this photograph that I took of it in 2014, it was made up of brightly colored Post-it notes, a ubiquitous thing in Hong Kong, like umbrellas being ubiquitous. And people wrote out slogans, hopes, and did drawings, and collectively created this kaleidoscopically beautiful site. And it became a gathering place during the protests of 2014. But then the 2014 protests wound down. The police basically the authorities waited this movement out, didn't give in to any of the major goals, such as the call for freer elections for chief executive. And over time, a period of disappointment set in Hong Kong after the umbrella movement, a worry that this effort to push back against the erosion of difference in Hong Kong was a futile or losing battle. And there were some things that happened, that not all of which got a lot of attention in the West, which paid a lot of attention during big social movements, but then attention drifts away. It's been a very distracting time in many parts of the world. But there were more signs of the erosion, of the sort of, to torture this metaphor, the East Berlinification of a former West Berlin. There were booksellers, 5 booksellers, who published the kinds of books that couldn't be published on the mainland, that were lightly sourced, gossipy books about the private lives of Communist Party leaders, and often presented the Communist Party leaders as engaged in sexual peccadillos and also being corrupt. The Chinese Communist Party never liked those books being in Hong Kong, but they allowed them to be published in part to maintain this one country, two systems thing. But there were these several booksellers involved with this who were spirited across the border and taken onto the mainland and incarcerated without any due process. In Hong Kong, there's always been a lot of due process in the past, and that's one of the markers of difference. They were then pressured and coerced into making confessions that were televised, admitting to having done wrong. And then some of them reappeared, but one of them, who's actually has Swedish citizenship, even though he was originally Chinese, the Chinese government refuses to acknowledge his Swedish citizenship, and they have continued to incarcerate him. And events like that were things that made people in the city worry about how anything could be done to stop this pattern of erosion. Another thing that happened was that after the umbrella movement, some activists decided that since they'd been unable to change the election of the chief executive, maybe they should focus on getting stronger democracy voices in the Legislative Council, which has more open elections. And then some of the activists, though, won elections and then were disqualified on technical grounds from serving the legislature. And that was another source of anger and frustration. When we think about the violence that's happened in some cases during the protests now on the part of protesters, acts of vandalism and things like that, one part of it is it's responding to police violence and frustration with the current movement being unable to gain concessions through nonviolence and peaceful means. But it's also a response to a period between the end of the umbrella movement in 2019, when things like the bookseller case, the disqualifying of legislators made people feel, go back to the frog metaphor, that the pot was reaching the boiling point very quickly. And calm measures and largely nonviolent, pacifist measures just were not yielding results. So back to the Berlin analogy, one thing that I found revisiting Hong Kong during this period of largely disappointment, though there were some protests, was that I revisited some of the sites that I'd gone to during the umbrella movement, looking for signs of Hong Kong still being different from the mainland and looking for signs that the differences were eroding. And when I went back to the place that the Lenin Wall had been, I found a few years after having visited it during umbrella movement, I found this blank concrete space where it was impossible to post any kind of political messages. And I thought about the Berlin analogy. On the west side of the Berlin Wall, the famous symbol of the difference between the two halves of Berlin, on the west side of the wall, people adorned it with colorful painting. It became, though it wasn't called the Lenin Wall, something a bit like the Lenin Wall. On the east side of the wall, on the other hand, it was tightly guarded because of fears that people would try to escape over it. And it was just a blank concrete space. So these two slides of the wall in 2014, and the Lenin Wall, and the same wall a few years later, to me symbolize that kind of umbrella movement effort to preserve the West Berlin type functions of Hong Kong and traditions of Hong Kong, and the East Berlin side. So when I've gone back to Hong Kong and looked for signs, though, of continuing difference, one thing I do is go to Chinese University of Hong Kong, where there's a replica of the Goddess of Democracy statue, a symbol of the 1989 protests, that cannot appear in any form on the mainland, but can still appear in Hong Kong. So thinking about how Hong Kong's differences haven't eroded, seeing that convinces me that there really are differences, while seeing that blank wall was a warning sign of the differences eroding. Another thing that I just want to mention quickly before going back much further in time briefly to set this into a longer-term historical perspective is one visit I made during a time of this sort of disappointment between the end of the umbrella movement and the start of these 2019 protests, and where I thought about what had changed and hadn't changed in Hong Kong. So in November of 2018, I was excited because a trip I was taking to Hong Kong happened to coincide with plans for an exhibition of work by a political cartoonist in exile who had gained fame internationally by doing cartoons mocking Xi Jinping and things like that couldn't be done on the mainland. So Hong Kong was going to show the first ever exhibition of his work. And I happened to be in Hong Kong, planning to go to Hong Kong for other reasons, right when it was going to happen. And Joshua Wong, who became the sort of leading symbol of the international symbol of the 2014 protests of the umbrella movement, who'd also been a leader of the 2012 protests as when he was only 15, he was going to speak at that event. And it was going to celebrate free speech and the fact that Hong Kong still had a high degree of it. And two members of the Russian activist group Pussy Riot were in Hong Kong to attend an LGBT event, and they were going to speak as well. So I was excited about that. The fact that this was taking place was a sign to me that Hong Kong's differences were still alive and well. And then the event was canceled. It was canceled because threats were made against family members of the cartoonist who were still in the mainland. A kind of thuggish response or effort to quell free speech that's become more common recently in the Chinese Communist Party's effort to prevent things from happening it doesn't want to happen. So the event was canceled, which to me was a sign of the erosion of Hong Kong's difference. So earlier in 2019, Joshua Wong and others were calling for a revival of the movement. And Joshua Wong placed that in a long-term perspective by going back to 1919 and 1989 in a tweet that made a big impact on me. But I later learned that he uses Twitter to connect to international audiences, and he thought that this would be a good way, he was right, to make international audiences think about Hong Kong as a place that was continuing in a kind of tradition of Chinese protest that went back to 1919 and to 1989. But one thing that's happened increasingly among protesters in Hong Kong is a desire to not see their efforts as folded into a narrative of what it means to be Chinese, because the Chinese Communist Party is increasingly saying that there's only one way to define Chineseness, and that's in the way they define it. So there's been a call for an emphasis more on Hong Konger identity. And Joshua Wong, being savvy to this on his Facebook page, which was aimed more at local audiences as opposed to Twitter to international ones, he didn't present the movement in these ways tied to Chinese history. So that's one way of thinking about how the same movement can be presented in different ways in different places. The movement then grew dramatically in early June, with one key moment being the vigil held on June 4th to honor the victims of the massacre of 1989, the June 4th massacre. No public event like that can be held on the mainland. In Macau, there's a very small vigil. There can be a vigil for that, but it tends to only attract a small number of people. In Hong Kong, there tend to be very large ones. And for the first time, I attended one of them. I went over there particularly to do that. And the fact that a large vigil could take place was a sign that Hong Kong had still some important differences from the mainland. So too is the fact that there's a June 4th museum in Hong Kong devoted to the events of 1989. But as this was taking place, a new law had been introduced, an extradition law, that would allow people to be who the authorities on the mainland thought had behaved inappropriately, while the mainland could be spirited from Hong Kong, a place that has its own legal system, to the mainland to be tried under a legal system in which there are few protections. And there was even fear that over time, what this would do would be make it routine for the kind of actions that took place through cloak and dagger kinds of means with the booksellers and with other people who've been spirited across the border, that this would then become routine. And this seemed to be a clear threat to the differentness of Hong Kong. So then there began to be large protests, and the protests picked up after the June 4th vigil. The June 4th vigil ended with a call for people to return and take part in a protest on the following Sunday. And 1 million people did turn out to do that. And in that case, the focus wouldn't be on looking backward to what had happened in Beijing in 1989, but to look forward about the need to preserve Hong Kong's degree of difference into the future. Right before I left before that giant protest, but just before I left on June 7th, there was a protest by a group of lawyers that I took a photo of here. A silent protest by black-robed legal professionals, not a group that we often think of as being likely to protest. And they were holding, in a sense, a vigil of their own, not for martyrs of the past, but for the impending death the rule of law in Hong Kong, which they saw the extradition law as heralding. Then the movement grew over the course of the summer, and I followed it from afar via tweets and articles written by bold journalists on the ground who braved tear gas and pepper spray to cover marches when increasingly the police were using harsh measures not only against protesters but also against journalists. And so this is a tweet. This is a photograph of two tweets by two Hong Konger journalists who were among those that I follow the writings of. So stepping back, because I am a historian, I want to bring some things in about Hong Kong's history. Hong Kong's history, and the key thing to remember about Hong Kong's modern history, is that it wasn't a free democratic place up till 1997. It was a colony of part of the British Empire. It became a colony at the end of the Opium War. And another thing important to remember about Hong Kong is it's always defied predictions. At the end of the Opium War, when Britain's prize, they wanted a foothold in China, when its chief negotiator got it Hong Kong, which was not a famous place at the time, the negotiator was fired by the British Foreign Secretary because he'd got an island that would, as the Foreign Secretary put in a letter, never be a great mart of trade. It would never be as great an entree point to the China market, he thought, as Canton and nearby Macau. Canton was part of China, and Macau was a Portuguese colony. Why couldn't you have gotten us something better? Lord Palmerston wrote in this letter, essentially. He was proved wrong because Hong Kong over time did become a great mart of trade. In 1840, it was just an island of Hong Kong that was given to the British, and it was built up and it had a good harbor, and that was key. And then in 1860, after the Second Opium War, more land just across the border, just across the water, across the harbor from Hong Kong, Kowloon, became added to the British colony, more than doubling it in size. Then in 1898, a whole set of other territory, which became known as the New Territory, villages and islands and other land near Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, were added to Hong Kong and greatly expanded multiple times its size. What's important about those territories, the new territories, though, was they weren't ceded to Britain in perpetuity in 1898. They were leased to Britain on a 99-year lease. And that lease ran out in 1997. And one reason why the handover was always likely to take place then was because the lease on those lands ran out. And even though Hong Kong Island and Kowloon were still British colonies, they were colonies that depended on the new territories for a lot of resources, including energy and water and food. And Hong Kong and Kowloon would be very isolated. By the latter part of the 20th century, Britain was also shedding its colonies. So it became natural to think, and negotiations were carried out between Britain and China to figure out the terms of it, for all of Hong Kong to be turned over in 1997. It's important to remember that Hong Kong didn't have full democracy. It was, under British colonial rule, governed by a governor who was appointed by London. One way, though, that protesters would see this, I think, is that they feel that Hong Kong, when most colonies go from being colonies to being independent entities, and the people of colonies go from being controlled by one distant capital to controlling their own fate, Hong Kong went from being controlled by one distant capital to being controlled by another distant capital. And somebody directly appointed by London to run things was replaced by somebody who was a kind of proxy of Beijing in the territory. In criticisms of the protests, one of the things that the Beijing official media emphasizes is the colonial past. It emphasizes that Hong Kong came into being as a city and it rose at a time when different countries, different empires, represented on this image from around 1900 by different menacing beasts carving out parts of Asia and encircling China, that you need to remember that past and emphasize that past. And they like to present 1997 as a time when Hong Kong was liberated from this dangerous form of rule, when what protesters say pushing back is that it wasn't liberated, it was just shifted from one kind of menacing foreign power to what was in essence another kind of menacing foreign power. So within the People's Republic of China, there are a series of areas that are that appear on PRC maps but have one or another degree of promised autonomy or real autonomy. PRC maps will like to show Taiwan as part of the PRC, but Taiwan functions as a largely self-governing independent space. So that's just a kind of fiction of some PRC maps. But on the other maps, there's another kind of fiction sometimes, which is that Xinjiang and Tibet, for example, which are the most tightly controlled parts of the PRC, are referred to as autonomous regions, when actually for most of the history of the PRC, they've been far from that. Far from being freer and having more autonomy than other parts of the country, they have less and are more tightly controlled. Hong Kong and Macau are promised at having a high degree of autonomy through the special administrative region idea and through the one country, two systems idea. Here is a map of Hong Kong that shows a sort of how it's perched beside other parts of the Pearl River Delta, and how some people are dreaming of a time when this becomes all integrated, and others see that as a nightmare of the time. And the question that's being struggled over with Hong Kong now is to what degree this kind of seamless integration will take place. So I want to end by thinking about, to put this into a couple of comparative perspectives. And one perspective is this idea of a greater Bay Area or a big Bay Area that will be a seamless integration. At the moment, one of the symbols of how Hong Kong is different, and Macau is more like Hong Kong than the mainland, is that you can search the web without being constrained by the Great Firewall in Hong Kong and Macau. So if that difference between the way the internet works across the border ever disappears, that will be a sign that will be very worrisome. It will be a sign of defeat for people in Hong Kong fighting to preserve a degree of difference. Where we are now is at a kind of in-between stage. And when I went to Hong Kong most recently and purchased a SIM card so that my phone would work in Hong Kong, I asked if the SIM card would work in Macau as well, because I planned to take a trip there, as I did. And I was partly going to go to test how the internet worked. And I found that the internet in Macau and Hong Kong work very differently than on the mainland. But what I didn't realize until I was leaving was that the SIM card I bought is one that works when you cross the border onto the mainland. Now, at the moment, it just shifts what phone provider you are using, so you can simply continue making phone calls and getting texts as if nothing had happened. When you cross the internet, you'll realize when you cross the mainland that something quite dramatic has happened. If you try to access sites that are banned on the mainland, suddenly they'll be banned. So the question going forward is if that difference in the internet working will disappear, and if it disappears in the direction of everything coming under the Great Firewall, that will be one of the most important symbols of the kind of thing I was talking about, of the two Berlins merging and everything becoming like East Berlin. Another way that I think it's useful to think about, and some people in Hong Kong are beginning to think about in ways that they didn't until that very few people were thinking about recently, was that sticking within Chinese historical frameworks, rather than thinking of a Berlin analogy, one could think of a Tibet analogy. Now, in Chinese numerology, 60-year cycles are very important. When the 12 signs of the zodiac and the five elements have made a complete cycle. Years are often referred to traditionally in China via one sign of the zodiac, an animal, and an element. And so gradually, 60 years complete a cycle in which each element has been paired with each symbol of the zodiac. So 60-year cycles in the Chinese imagination sometimes are similar to centenaries, or in in the Western imagination. So what happened exactly 60 years ago, and what does this have to do with Hong Kong? Well, in the early 1950s, when Tibet became forcibly integrated into the People's Republic of China, it was promised that it would have a high degree of autonomy and people would be able to live very different kinds of lives, follow a different religion freely, and many things would be different there, even though they'd be part of the PRC. And for a while, in the early 1950s, it seemed that a light touch was being laid on Tibet, and this possibility of being part of a Communist Party-run state, but not completely controlled by it, seemed possible. But then controls began tightening, and there was a big uprising in 1959 to fight for preserving Tibet's differences, and it was crushed. And then Tibet, over time, became one of the most tightly controlled parts of the country. And that ability to live differently disappeared as pushes toward, or it didn't disappear, but people had to fight hard to preserve it, and there were draconian forms of rule and efforts to force a kind of assimilation. So Tibet was not, the terminology was not used as one country, two systems then, but it was really one country, two systems avant la lettre. It was the kind of idea of one country, two systems, even if not said in those words. And then, after 1959, that disappeared, and it went to being tightly controlled. So Hong Kong could be seen as being in a similar situation, one 60-year cycle down, fighting a last-ditch effort, like the uprising was a last-ditch effort to prevent the kind of complete absorption, but complete absorption being in the future. And that's one thing that people fear. And they also bring up Xinjiang protesters as that being a possibility for Hong Kong's future. And that, knowing about what's going on in those places, helps explain, I think, the desperation that keeps the movement going, even when it seems so impossible that it could win. I want to close, though, with two other ways of thinking comparatively about what's going on in Hong Kong now and what repression has taken and the forms it has taken and could take. So one of the other ways to think about it, and this again gets us back closer to East and West Berlin, is to think about Hong Kong as currently being a bit like satellite states in the old Soviet Empire, where during the height of the Cold War, places like Hungary and Poland and East Germany were controlled by officials who depended largely on Moscow, the way that the chief executive in Hong Kong depends largely on Beijing. When there were upheavals in those places that challenged the local authorities, sometimes Moscow would send in direct military aid to suppress those things, such as in the Hungarian uprising in 1956. But at other points, they would push for the local proxy power holder to just take care of it on their own, knowing that when push came to shove, if absolutely necessary, the capital would help on their side. And that's what happened, and I think this is one of the analogies that's most worth thinking about for Hong Kong now. That's what happened in the early 1980s in Poland, when Solidarity, a movement that gained a tremendous degree of support, rose up against the Polish authorities and was crushed by the Polish authorities, and leaders were jailed and martial law was imposed. That movement went underground, and then in 1989 it succeeded, and it reemerged. It had just been dormant, and there was the first free election, and Solidarity won in 1989. So that could be seen as a hope for Hong Kong's future, that even if this movement is crushed, as it seems very likely it will be, and is in the process of being, then maybe the spirit could reemerge and something could succeed down the line. We should remember that history often surprises us, that the history of Hong Kong has been full of things that made fools out of people who predicted, as the person in the 1840s who predicted Hong Kong would never become a great mart of trade was wrong. There have also been things in China that have defied predictability. So last of all, I want to return to this tweet of Joshua Wong and say that one other way that, at least for a historian, to think about what's happening right now in 2019 is to think not of a 60-year cycle, but of the idea of the 100-year flood. And this is an idea Adam Hochschild has recently written about in the case of America, where he sees some disturbing echoes of 1919, a worrisome year in American history, in what's happening in 2019. This idea that every 100 years, a river will change its course, or there'll be a flood, and something dramatically change, and it can cause disaster. So in 1919, there was a great upheaval, the May 4th movement, which I won't go into details about, but it was an effort in large part, to stop parts of northern China and Shandong province from going from being German colonial territories to being Japanese colonial territories. At the end of World War I, people hoped that those territories would be returned to Chinese control, and they weren't. And the protests pushed back against that. And May 4th is now remembered as a success because it helped lead to, in the Communist Party's way of telling history, helped lead to the founding of the Communist Party, and eventually to the founding of a new China in 1949. And so it's seen as leading to great things. Other people look at it as a success because the protesters achieved some of their goals. They succeeded in getting some officials they hated dismissed from office. They succeeded in having the authorities apologize for arresting students, or at least let them out of prison. And the Treaty of Versailles, that was the international treaty in which Chinese representatives were part, having been on the side of the Allies in World War I, the Chinese delegation refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles that transferred parts of Shandong from German to Japanese control. But from another point of view, it was a failure because Japan was able to take control of those territories, even though the Treaty of Versailles went into effect, even though the Chinese delegation didn't sign it. And then in the next 25 years, the big story was not about China regaining control of territory, but actually of losing control of more territory. And the big story in the region was the rise of an increasingly assertive Japanese empire. Thinking about 2019 and these protests in Hong Kong, one thing that the world should be concerned about is whether the fate of Hong Kong is a harbinger of things to come in a rising China now that in some ways may be worrying at least to its neighbors, and is perceived as worrying at least to its neighbors in the ways that in retrospect the rise of Japan around 1919 was. Now that's a giant macro way of thinking, but I do think thinking about this tradition, thinking about the protests of 1919 as an effort by determined youth to fight back, to try to increase control over a community, to increase the ability of members of a community they love to control its own fate, in that case, a country, parallels in some ways the efforts in 2019 by passionate youth, and then followed onto the streets by members of many other social groups and many other generations, fighting passionately to try to have a community they love, in this case, a territory, a city, and the area around it, to get a greater say in its control, and facing, in each case, very large international forces of a shifting geopolitical world. So it's been a challenge as a historian to be talking about a process that's still going on, a crisis that's still going on, and who knows what will have happened in Hong Kong by the time you watch this. But it's been a great pleasure to be able to share my thoughts on the crisis in Hong Kong and why it matters and ways to think about it with you. So thank you very much for your attention.